When Japanese engineers finished a bunker on a Pacific island, they knew what was coming for it. They had planned for tanks, for artillery, for waves of Marines crossing open sand into interlocking fire. They had not planned for a construction crew. They had not planned for a 20-ton machine with no gun and no turret, driven by a man in a work shirt, grinding toward the firing slit while rifle rounds sparked off a raised steel blade. And they had not planned to die the way so many of them did. Not shot, not burned, buried alive, sealed inside the fortress they had built to keep themselves safe. This is the story of the American bulldozer in the Pacific, and the men who turned a machine meant to move Earth into one that closed tombs. But this story does not start with a bulldozer. It starts with a problem the most powerful Navy on Earth could not solve. In November of 1943, the United States Marine Corps landed at Betio, a flat scrap of coral in the Tarawa Atoll barely 300 acres across. Before the landing, the Navy poured something on the order of 3,000 tons of shells onto that one island. Officers watching believed nothing could live through it. One Marine general told his men they were about to deliver the greatest concentration of naval gunfire and aerial bombardment in the history of modern warfare. They were right about the fire. They were wrong about what it would do. The Japanese commander had turned Betio into roughly 500 pillboxes, blockhouses, and gun positions. Coconut logs stacked 5 to 8 feet thick, reinforced concrete, coral and sand packed over steel plate. The firing slits were narrow, and every position covered the beach and the position beside it. Some of those bunkers could take a direct hit from a battleship and keep firing. When the shelling lifted, the defenders climbed back to their guns. The Marines crossed the reef into a wall of fire. 76 hours later, Betio was taken, at a cost of 1,009 Americans killed and 2,101 wounded, most of them spent reducing those bunkers one at a time at a range measured in feet. That was the lesson, written on a beach in blood. You could not break these positions from a mile out to sea. You had to come up to the slit and kill what was inside it. And that was a job that could bleed an infantry company white. The answer, when it came, did not arrive with a gun. It arrived with a bulldozer, and the men who drove it were not soldiers by trade. They were carpenters, electricians, welders, heavy equipment operators pulled out of quarries and job sites across America. They were the Seabees. The name comes from the initials CB for Construction Battalion. The Navy built them out of hard necessity. Before the war, it raised its overseas bases with civilian contractors. But under international law, a civilian who picks up a weapon to resist an attack can be shot as a guerrilla. Once the fighting started, that was untenable. So in early 1942, Rear Admiral Ben Morrell won the authority to recruit tradesmen straight into uniform, men who could build under fire and fight to hold what they built. Morrell gave them a Latin motto, Construimus batuimus, we build, we fight. The men gave themselves a shorter one, can do. They were not young. The Navy prized skill over youth, so the enlistment age ran as high as 50, and the average Seabee was around 37 years old. A few men past 60 talked their way in. More than 325,000 of them would serve before the war ended, on 300 islands and 4 continents. The machine at the center of it was almost always a Caterpillar. The D7 weighed around 13 tons bare and made roughly 80 horsepower from a 4-cylinder diesel. The bigger D8 pushed past 15 tons and better than 130 horsepower. Caterpillar built more than 20,000 D7s during the war, close to half of everything the company produced. The blades on the front came from other firms, Letourneau chief among them. None of it was built to fight. A bulldozer carries no real armor, no weapon, and an operator who sits high and completely exposed. On paper, it is the last machine you would send toward a working machine gun. That is exactly the point, because the dozer could do one thing a tank could not, and a flamethrower could not, and a battleship could not. It could make a fortified position simply cease to exist, not suppress it, not scar it, bury it, push tons of earth and coral over the slit, or drop the blade through the roof, and seal the men inside with their own gun. A tank kills and rolls on, and the enemy crawls back to the hole. Earth over a firing slit is permanent. The clearest proof of what that meant came on the morning of the 27th of October, 1943, on Mono Island in the Treasury Group, just north of Bougainville. Seabees of the 87th Naval Construction Battalion came ashore alongside New Zealand infantry about an hour into the assault, bringing a jeep and 2 bulldozers with them. Almost at once, a coconut log pillbox roughly 8 yards from the open bow of a landing ship opened fire with a machine gun. It also held a twin-barreled 37mm cannon. The unloading stopped cold, and naval guns could do nothing about a target that close to friendly troops. A junior officer, Lieutenant Charles Turnbull, turned to one of his equipment operators, a machinist's mate from Milford, Massachusetts, named Aurelio Tassone, and told him to take the bunker with his dozer. Tassone's machine had no armor. None. His only protection was the blade, and he raised it like a shield and drove. He went in low gear, straight at the slit, 20 tons of steel grinding forward, while machine gun rounds hammered the raised blade and whined off it into the air. Turnbull walked behind him with a carbine. The New Zealanders threw grenades and poured on fire. Tassone reached the pillbox, dropped the blade onto it, and drove the whole structure down into the earth. Then he pushed logs and sand over what was left, burying the position and the dozen defenders and their gun inside it. A correspondent for Time magazine wrote up the scene that year. The bullets banged off the raised blade, and in his words, the tractor rolled on like its armored offspring, the tank. Later, the grave was dug back open. 12 bodies and a large new gun were brought out. Tassone received the Silver Star. So did Turnbull, for walking into machine gun fire with a carbine to cover a man on a tractor. It was the highest award given to anyone in the 87th in the entire war, and the story is widely credited with inspiring the climax of the 1944 John Wayne film about the Seabees. If you want the real mechanics of how these battles were actually won, the tools and the tactics and the men who use them, subscribe. It is the surest way for the next one to reach you. Now, the thing Tassone did to one bunker was about to be done to entire islands. The Seabees had been fighting almost from the start. In September of 1942, the 6th Naval Construction Battalion landed on Guadalcanal behind the 1st Marine Division and set to keeping Henderson Field alive, filling craters in the runway faster than the Japanese could blow them open, often under fire. That October, a Seabee named Lawrence Meyer manned a salvaged machine gun and shot down a Japanese Zero. He was the first Seabee decorated for valor, and he was dead about 2 weeks later, killed when naval gunfire hit the barge he was working on. The Silver Star was posthumous. By the time the Americans reached the Fortress Islands of 1944 and 45, the builders already knew how to fight. What changed was the enemy. After Tarawa, the Japanese learned their own lesson. Fighting at the waterline only fed men into American firepower. So on the later islands, they went underground. At Pelelu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, they carved the high ground into honeycombs of caves and tunnels, mutually supporting and joined beneath the surface so that a position cleared at noon could be firing again by dark through a passage no American had found. They called it Fukaku, defense in depth, and its purpose was not to win. It was to make every yard cost as much American blood as possible. Fire and explosives could open a cave. They could not close it. The bulldozer could. At Pelelu, when flame and napalm and demolition charges failed against the honeycomb, armored bulldozers were driven up to collapse the entrances and seal the men in the rock. The Army division that finished the fight did much of its last work exactly that way. Of a garrison of around 11,000 Japanese soldiers, roughly 19 were taken alive. 200 caves were later found sealed and forgotten. At Okinawa, it became routine. One U.S. Army division alone recorded 273 caves sealed and more than 300 pillboxes and emplacements destroyed. Sometimes gasoline was pumped into a cave and set alight. Other times the blade simply brought the hillside down across the mouth. Here, the honest part of this story has to be said plainly, because this audience will ask, and they will be right to. There is no surviving Japanese diary, no letter, no prisoner interrogation that names the bulldozer as the weapon they dreaded most. When Japanese survivors of these battles spoke of what terrified them, they named the flamethrower. The fear of the dozer, as its own specific thing, is something we read from the outside. We should say so. What is not in doubt is the death itself. Being sealed alive inside a collapsing bunker or a caved-in tunnel, in the dark, with the air going bad, was one of the worst ends the war produced. And it was not rare. It happened because the American habit of burying positions met the Japanese refusal to surrender, and together the two filled hundreds of caves with men who chose the dark over capture. On Iwo Jima, a Japanese-American interpreter once gave a cave garrison a blunt choice: surrender or a death by fire and burial together. Most of that group walked out. That account comes from the American side, not the Japanese, but it tells you what the choice looked like from inside the hill. Many of those caves were never reopened. On Okinawa and Peleliu, they are still sealed today, the dead still inside. One archaeologist who has surveyed them called the conditions men lived in down there indescribably awful and hopeless. Some of the caves still hold the smell of old fire. None of this came free for the men on the machines. The bulldozer's great weakness never went away. The operator sat up high, in the open, with no way to shoot back, and snipers understood exactly what he was worth. One Seabee on New Guinea watched a Japanese sniper kill the operator on the dozer beside him, grabbed the rifle he kept on his own machine, found the sniper in the tree line, and shot him. Others were not fast enough. On Saipan, on Iwo Jima, operators were picked off at the controls. Iwo Jima cost the most. 2 Seabee battalions landed in the assault waves, minutes behind the 1st Marines, onto beaches of soft volcanic ash already ranged by Japanese mortars. They laid steel matting so the tanks could climb off the sand and cut exits under fire. One of them, the 133rd Naval Construction Battalion, took the heaviest losses of any Seabee battalion in the war. Out of about 1,100 men, 42 were killed, many on the first day, and the survivors had to hand their mission to another unit because too few of them were left to finish it. The Seabees came out of the war a permanent part of the Navy, and they are still here. Their descendants, the Naval Mobile Construction Battalions, deploy today. The armored dozer they improvised with scrap steel on those beaches hardened into real doctrine, running through Korea and the Rome plows of Vietnam down to the armored machines in service now. At the entrance to Arlington National Cemetery, there is a memorial to them, a bronze Seabee greeting a small child, sculpted by a man who had been a Seabee himself. The inscription promises that for these men, the difficult was done at once, and the impossible took only a little longer. And that is the strange truth underneath all of it. The most final weapon on those islands, the one that closed the fortress for good, was never built as a weapon at all. It was built to move earth, to make solid ground where there was none. In the hands of a carpenter from Massachusetts, with a blade raised against the bullets, it did both things at once. It made the ground, and then it made the graves.